There is a hill in central Scotland where, according to legend, a king named Fergus mac Ferchard was crowned in the year 330 BC. The stone beneath his feet, a rough, sandstone block, had been carried from Ireland by the ancient Scotsy tribe. And before that, some said it had come from Egypt, carried by a princess named Skoda who fled the pharaoh's court and sailed west across the Mediterranean. The stone was sacred. The stone was eternal. The stone was the living proof that Scotland was not merely a nation. It was a civilization older than Rome, older than Athens, older than almost anything the ancient world had produced. For centuries, Scottish kings were crowned upon it. Wars were fought over it, entire national identities were built on top of it, and the story of that stone, the stone of destiny, was told as settled, unquestionable, ancient fact. That's the story. Here's what actually happened. The stone is real. The crowning ceremonies were real. The wars were real. But almost everything told about the stone's origins, the Egyptian princess, the Irish migration, the 330 BC coronation, was invented, not misremembered. Not exaggerated, invented deliberately by medieval writers who understood something that modern political strategists still understand today, that a nation without an ancient past is a nation without legitimacy. And Scotland was far from alone. Across the world, in countries we think of as ancient, proud, and historically deep-rooted, the founding stories that hold those nations together were constructed. Sometimes recently, sometimes cynically, almost always successfully. This is the story of how nations manufacture their own origins, why it works, and who, exactly, did the manufacturing. That stone beneath the king's feet. Keep that image in mind. We'll come back to it. To understand why nations invent their pasts, you have to understand what a nation actually needs to survive. It needs a story, not laws, not borders, not even a shared language. It needs a story that makes the people inside it feel that they belong to something older and greater than themselves. The historian Benedict Anderson called nations imagined communities, not because they aren't real, but because the millions of people who feel bound together by nationality will never meet each other, never know each other, and yet feel a profound kinship. That kinship has to come from somewhere, and when history doesn't provide a clean, satisfying origin, when the actual past is messy, complicated, or embarrassingly recent, the temptation to fill the gap with legend is almost irresistible. Scotland's medieval chroniclers understood this perfectly. In the early 14th century, as Scotland fought for survival against English domination, a document called the Declaration of Arbroath was written, one of the most eloquent statements of national identity ever produced. It told of the Scottish people's ancient origins in Scythia, of their migration through Spain and across the sea, of their unbroken lineage stretching back further than any other European nation. It was stirring. It was beautifully written, and historians today are fairly certain that significant portions of it were, at minimum, embellished beyond any recoverable historical truth. But here's the important part. It worked. The Declaration of Arbroath didn't just inspire Scots in 1320. It inspired them in 1820, and it still inspires them today. A crafted myth, once embedded in national consciousness, becomes indistinguishable from history. But Scotland isn't even the most striking example. For that, we need to travel further back and further east, to a country whose entire ancient identity was constructed almost entirely within living memory of people who are still alive today. When the modern state of Greece declared independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1821, the Greeks who led the revolution faced an immediate and slightly uncomfortable problem. The world, and particularly the educated European world, expected Greece to be the direct heir of ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the cradle of Western civilization. Europeans had grown up reading Homer and Plato and Thucydides, and they desperately wanted the modern Greeks to be the living descendants of those ancient giants. The only problem was that the actual population of what became modern Greece had spent the last several centuries under Ottoman rule, speaking a vernacular form of Greek that would have been largely unrecognizable to Plato. practicing a form of Eastern Orthodox Christianity that had almost nothing to do with the religion of Socrates, and living in communities whose daily customs owed as much to Turkish and Balkan influences as to anything identifiably ancient Athenian. That stone beneath the king's feet. The gap between what it was supposed to represent and what it actually was. That gap is where nations live. The Greek intellectual class of the early 19th century was acutely aware of this problem, and they set about solving it with remarkable energy. Scholars like Adamantios Korais spent decades trying to purify the modern Greek language, stripping out Turkish loanwords, archaizing grammar and vocabulary, constructing a form of Greek that felt more connected to the classical past. Folk traditions were reinterpreted. Customs were traced back to ancient origins, whether those origins existed or not. The historian Stathis Gourgouris has written extensively about how modern Greek identity was, in large part, a conscious scholarly construction. A nation assembling itself from the raw materials of a classical past, it was simultaneously inheriting and inventing. This wasn't cynicism. The men doing it genuinely believed in what they were building. But the raw material they were working with was, in significant part, mythological. And the most striking version of this process happened not in Europe, but in the heart of East Asia. Japan today is understood by most of the world as an ancient, tradition-soaked civilization. Samurai, the emperor's divine lineage, the tea ceremony, the rigid codes of honor and social order that define what most people think of as Japanese culture. Almost none of it is as old as it looks. The historian Eric Hobsbawm, in his landmark 1183 collection, The Invention of Tradition, a book every serious history student should have on their shelf, and a text that shapes the argument of this video considerably. Hobsbawm demonstrated that many of the traditions we assume are ancient were invented relatively recently, often for very specific political purposes. Japan is one of his central examples, and if you find that argument compelling enough to dig deeper, this channel exists precisely to take you further inside those arguments. So consider staying close. In the 1860s and 1870s, Japan underwent one of the most dramatic political transformations in modern history, the Meiji Restoration. A new government, determined to modernize Japan and compete with Western imperial powers, needed to construct a new national identity. And crucially, they needed that identity to feel ancient, unified, and sacred. So they did something extraordinary. They took the figure of the emperor, who had been, for centuries, a largely ceremonial figure with limited real political power, and transformed him into the living embodiment of an unbroken, divine lineage stretching back to the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. Shinto, previously a loose collection of local religious practices, was formalized, nationalized, and declared the ancient spiritual tradition of the Japanese people. The samurai codes of Bushido, which most people assume are medieval in origin, were largely codified and romanticized during this same period, drawn from earlier texts but systematized and promoted as a national identity, precisely when Japan needed one. Ancient costumes for the emperor's court were designed by committee and declared traditional. Rituals were invented, written down, and almost immediately treated as timeless. The men doing this weren't hiding what they were doing, at least, not entirely. They knew they were constructing something. But they also understood that the construction, once complete, would take on a life of its own, and it did. The mythology of the divine emperor and the ancient samurai tradition would go on to fuel some of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century. The invented past, once believed, has real consequences. That stone beneath the king's feet, the pattern repeats with almost eerie consistency. In Ireland, the Gaelic revival of the late 19th century saw poets, scholars, and nationalists like W.B. Yeats and Douglas Hyde construct a vision of ancient Celtic Ireland, mystical, heroic, spiritually pure, that owed as much to romantic imagination as to archaeological reality. The Irish language was promoted, not merely as a communication tool but as the sacred vessel of an unbroken ancient identity. Customs were revived, some of them genuinely old, some of them essentially reconstructed from fragmentary evidence. The image of ancient Ireland that fired the imagination of the 9916 Easter Rising rebels was, in significant part, an image that had been assembled within the previous 30 years. Finland did something similar and did it with extraordinary self-awareness. The Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, was published in 1835 by a physician and folklorist named Elias Lönnrot. Lönnrot traveled through rural Finland and Karelia collecting oral folk songs, genuine fragments of an ancient oral tradition, and then stitched them together into a coherent epic narrative that Finland had never actually possessed. He wasn't entirely fabricating. The raw material was real. But the shape he gave it, the narrative arc, the sense of a unified Finnish mythological world, that was his creation. And Finns embraced it immediately as the proof of their ancient national identity. The Kalevala became the foundation stone of Finnish cultural nationalism, the justification for Finnish independence, the spiritual center of a nation that had not yet officially existed when Lönnrot published his first edition. A physician from a small town had, essentially, written his country's ancient past. And here is where the story becomes genuinely strange, because in every one of these cases, the invention worked. Scotland still reveres the Stone of Destiny. Greece still feels the gravitational pull of classical Athens. Japan's imperial traditions still command profound respect. Ireland's Celtic mysticism is still a live cultural force. The Kalevala is still Finland's national epic. The myths outlasted the men who made them. The stories proved more durable than the historical record they were built on top of, which raises the question that historians have been wrestling with ever since Hobsbawm and his colleagues first named this phenomenon. Does it matter? If a myth unites a people, inspires genuine courage and sacrifice, creates a community that functions and endures, does the historical accuracy of its foundations actually matter? The uncomfortable answer, the one that the evidence keeps producing, is yes. It matters enormously. Not because mythology is inherently wrong. Human beings have always told stories about themselves, and always will, but because the specific myths that nations tell about their origins tend to encode specific claims. Claims about who belongs and who doesn't. Claims about ancient enemies and ancient allies. Claims about sacred territories and divine rights. The medieval Scottish chronicles didn't just tell a flattering story about Scottish origins. They made claims about Scottish sovereignty that were used to justify real wars. The Meiji-era mythology of the divine emperor didn't just give Japan a sense of identity. It provided the ideological foundation for imperial expansion across Asia. The romantic image of ancient Celtic Ireland didn't just inspire poetry. It drew a line around Irish identity that left certain people inside and certain people outside. The invented past is never politically neutral. It always serves someone. The question, always, is who? In most of the cases we've looked at, the answer is surprisingly consistent. The beneficiaries of invented national mythology tend to be the intellectuals and political classes who do the inventing, the scholars who gain prestige, the politicians who gain legitimacy, the clergy who gain authority, the merchants and publishers who gain markets. The ordinary people who believe the myths most completely are often the ones who benefit from them least. The Irish peasant who died for the vision of ancient Celtic Ireland had little in common with the romantic poets in Dublin drawing rooms who had conjured that vision. The Japanese soldier who died believing in the ancient divine mandate of the emperor was dying for a mandate that had been written by a government committee in Tokyo 3 decades earlier. And yet the Irish peasant's courage was real. The Japanese soldier's conviction was real. The Scottish king's pride in that stone beneath his feet was real. The myths produced real human experiences, real sacrifices, real achievements. That is what makes this history so genuinely difficult. The invented past is false, but the feelings it generates are true. The tradition is fabricated, but the community it creates is not. That stone beneath the king's feet, not quite what it claimed to be, but it held something together anyway. The historian Anthony Smith spent much of his career arguing that national myths don't emerge from nothing, that the inventors of national pasts are always working with real raw material. however much they reshape it. Scotland did have an ancient history. Greece was genuinely connected to the classical world. Japan did have genuine ancient traditions. Finland did have genuine oral folk culture. The mythmakers didn't build from pure air. They built from fragments, distortions, selections. But the fragments were real. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion available to us, that every nation lives somewhere between the myth and the reality, drawing its energy from the story it tells about itself, and that the job of history is not to destroy those stories, but to understand them clearly enough that they cannot be weaponized without our noticing. What is extraordinary, and what the evidence keeps insisting upon, is how recently most of these ancient-seeming traditions were actually constructed. The Divine Emperor of Japan, largely an 1870s invention. The Celtic mysticism of Ireland, largely an 1880s and 1890s construction. The Kalevala epic of Finland, 1835. The romantic Highland Scottish identity. The kilts, the clan tartans, the bagpipe culture that the entire world now associates with ancient Scotland, largely invented in the early 19th century. Partly by a novelist named Walter Scott, who organized a royal pageant in 1822 and essentially costumed an entire nation in traditions that were, at most, a few decades old, ancient, traditional, timeless. The words nations use most confidently about themselves are almost always the words that deserve the most scrutiny. If the story of invented national pasts fascinates you, and it should, because it is the story of how the modern world was actually assembled, then there is another thread on this channel that pulls at the same loose end, and it concerns something far more intimate than national flags and founding epics. It concerns the traditions inside your own life, the rituals you perform at weddings, at funerals, at birthdays, traditions that feel ancient and universal and deeply human, and that turn out, when you pull the thread, to be almost as recently invented as the Highland tartan. The people who invented them had names, they had motives. And the story of why those traditions exist is stranger and more revealing than the traditions themselves.